Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here, in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Jake Friedman.
And I'm Brendan Hansen.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And today's episode is a deep dive of a Stefan Feld game from 2007.
Ding, ding, ding.
Jake and I just couldn't get enough. We're back here. 2022 isn't officially over, and we're covering our first game of 2023. And we thought, what better way to kick off the year? Maybe a little prematurely, with a deep dive right back into Stefan Feld, a designer that both Jake and I really enjoy, with a game that is known for having a brutal design. So in this episode, we'll sort of talk about if we think that that reputation is warranted. We'll talk through some of the interesting mechanics that are here that influence his other games. And I'd love to get to the bottom of, with Jake, what makes a Feld game really feel like a Feld game. Also, just so you know why we're covering a game right now, but counting it in our 2023 after our year-end review, it's because we wanted to really line up our episodes. So we're going to, next week, take a break from recording. So don't expect an episode of Decision Space to publish next week, but the following week will be episode 100 of Decision Space. It's going to be a mission planning episode where we talk about games that we're excited to cover in 2023 and maybe beyond on this show. And then episode 101, the following episode, Jake and I are calling Decision Space 101. It's going to be an overview of what we think are some of the best episodes that we've done in essentially the first 2 years of this podcast, a reflection on all the things we've learned, and also a reflection on how this project's been going. Have we accomplished our mission in some ways? What could we do better? Where do we want to take the show in the future? So we hope you'll join us for those 2 episodes because they're undoubtedly going to be awesome. But today, it's in the year of the dragon, Stefan Feld, all day long. So Jake, what's your opinion and review of this game?
In the Year of the Dragon is one of the most frustrating learning experiences I've had with a game on this show, just because, like, for whatever reason, like, this game is not that complex. We played many more games that are much more complex than this, just from like a rules overhead load. This one was really tough for me to understand and get into. It also makes me feel really dumb, profoundly stupid in a way that few other board games do, because you could just see the whole game laid out in front of you. So, early on, I've said this is probably my least favorite Feld game. I'm not sure if that holds up anymore. Now that I've played it so much and started to get into it, I'm definitely finding enjoyment in this game, but I still don't think it's at like the top of Feld games for me. So I think I want to put it somewhere in the range of like 7.5.
Interesting. Okay. So a good game, one that you enjoy, but not one that you're going to bump into your upper echelon of Stefan Feld
it's like
games.
Hanging out with like Aquasphere and like the castles of Tuscany.
Uh-oh. Jake mentioned the castles of Tuscany. It's not a good sign. Okay,
I think that's a fun game.
I haven't played it actually, so I shouldn't spread too much hate on it. But here's my review, and then we can kind of get into it. But In the Year of the Dragon is a terse and tense entry in Feld's ludography. It's equal parts brutal, rewarding, and challenging, and also fun. Despite its core being a point salad style Euro game, its theme shines through in every play. There's agony and joy in this speedy but dense design, and I wish we saw more games that weren't afraid to toss its players straight in the deep end, like In the Year of the Dragon. 9 out of 10.
Whoa.
I really enjoy this game. I think this is a fantastic game.
Dang. Rocket takeoff right there. That's higher than I expected. And I think we'll get into more of our, different of opinion as we get into the episode. Like, I know, for example, you feel like this is a very variable game, and that hasn't been as much my experience. So I'd be really interested to dive in more into those differences. But we should probably head right into our kind of game background to sort of put people into the space where this game came out, because it is one of Stefan Feld, my personal favorite designer's earliest game.
Yeah, you might know Stefan Feld for games that we've already mentioned on the show, like the Castles of Burgundy or Bonfire or Forum or Trajan, some of his most well-known designs. But In the Year of the Dragon came out in the third year in which Stefan Feld had a published game. It came out in 2007, and it was published alongside Notre Dame. So it was probably his third or fourth published design, depending on which one of those was signed first. Before this, Stefan Feld only had 2 published designs. In 2006, Rum and Pirates was published, which is a game that you'll occasionally hear discussed, I think, among really fanatical Feld fans.
Yeah,
or people
I would think like it probably requires that you're like, I want to play all of Feld games.
Yeah,
right?
that's the only way you're getting back.
You have to
from Rum and
seek it out
Pirates.
for
Yep.
sure.
Or maybe if you've been in the hobby for a really, really long time.
Yeah, if you played it when it
aware
came out.
Exactly. And then preceding that, Rum and Pirates in 2006, there was Roma in 2005, Stefan Feld's first design, a game I truthfully know nothing about.
Yeah, me neither. So really good job on for us on our research, but
But I think it underscores that this is a very old design, both in Feld's oeuvre and also his ludography, but also just sort of when this was coming out. This is a game that I think is of a different time in board games. And we can sort of talk about if it feels that way or if it doesn't. I might make the argument that it somehow manages to feel pretty modern and pretty fresh.
Totally. Yeah, it's funny. It's like everything old is new again, kind of in board games a little bit. Where interestingly, like Notre Dame is a game that came out, you said, in 2007 as well. Have you played that one?
I have not.
So that is like an interesting little, I guess it's action selection game, or maybe you would consider it worker placement game where you're kind of building out. You're not building out. You're like, I don't know, like you have your own sector of the city that you're like upgrading various bits. So it's like this interesting mechanism where like if you go to a space one time, you get 1 gold. And then if you go there with the second action cube on like a future, then you'd get like 2 gold and like so on and so forth. So it like incentivizes like hitting the same spots over and over. And there's more going on in the game than that. But that one felt to me when I played it like a game that's just been like iterated upon and improved. Like it didn't hold together perfectly. Where when I play in the Year of the Dragon, it feels like totally different than any other game that I've played. Like I don't know that this particular game has such a clear kind of design tree that would follow from it.
Yeah, which I think might be part of the reason why I enjoy it so much is it feels really unique in terms of games that I've played even in the past 5 or 10 years. Like there aren't a lot of games that are like this game, and it's a very simple game. So it sort of stands on its own. Interestingly, I just want to sort of add some other touchstones to Stefan Feld design so people sort of can find themselves within the ludography. So in 2009, Macau came out, which is another older game, but that one that people mention pretty frequently. It has this cool delayed resource selection mechanism. That's one I'd be curious about covering on the show maybe someday.
Yeah.
And then in 2011, that's when the Castles of Burgundy came out.
I think Macau is one of the games that was tapped in the new city like game series that Queen Games is putting out, sort of re-implementing a lot of these classic Feld designs that are difficult to get these days. So yeah, interesting that one got that treatment, and Into the Year of the Dragon not yet.
Well,
which maybe
it's not named after a city. How could you bring it into you can't call this Amsterdam. What are we gonna do? I guess we could just call it,
like Beijing.
Yeah.
Or something along those lines.
But they chose not to for now. It's not rooted in a city. I will say that. You don't, in Bruges, you really feel that. But then again, I haven't played Macau. I wonder how much Macau feels like it's the city of Macau. Probably not.
I'll spoil it for you. Not at all.
Yeah, not at all. Okay.
It's like mostly like about like trade routes in like the Mediterranean.
Okay, this is the last little
Is that the Mediterranean? I really hope so, or else I'm going to look like an idiot.
Macau is in Southeast. It's in the Pacific. So, I have to tell you, so not the Mediterranean. But that's okay.
What are you trying to say here? I should tell the audience I have a cold. Okay, this is not the best version of myself. So
I like that you saved it for there. This is my final question for you, Jake. Before we actually get into the meat of In the Year of the Dragon, do you think Bruges feels like it's set in the city of Bruges?
I mean, like, I think this is getting into like the what is a Feld game ethos. It's like absolutely not, right? Like it could be it could be any city, it could be any sort of theme, really. Like, I would recommend people check out the Shut Up and Sit Down video they did on this series of Queen games, City games. They like review all 4 in one review, and they have this really funny bit where they like describe what's happening in the game in the exact same terminology for every single game, and it fits.
Yep, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's kind of the world of Stefan Feld. But interestingly, I'm not sure. This game kind of sets itself apart from some of his other designs. We can talk about if it feels thematic in the back end, but I just wanted to sort of situate that for people. And based on my experience, I was really surprised that this is the sort of 3rd or 4th, depending on your counting, published design from Stefan Feld.
Yeah, totally. And only, it's funny, like, too, entering the hobby at the point I did, it was like Stefan Feld always existed, right?
Yeah, sure.
You know, so it's just interesting to think sort of like how young we are in this sort of like golden age of modern board gaming, where you can take some of the most like legendary designers ever, and like they've only been doing this for 17 years, which is, hey, that's a lot of time. Like, that's cool, you know, but that's not like that much time. You know what I mean? Like, that's
sure.
Like for like somebody that's on a lot of people's like Mount Rushmore of game design for a very problematic Americanized example of
The Legend of Zelda predates Stefan Feld's designs by 20 years.
Yeah, there you go.
2 decades. So yeah, it's interesting.
Well, should we jump right into your rules overview to give people a little bit of a better idea of what's going on in the Year of the Dragon and why it may not fit with their conception of what a Stefan Feld game is? And then we'll meet back on the other side to do our traditional decision space deep dive of this classic game.
In the Year of the Dragon is an action drafting game played over the course of 12 rounds, representing the 12 months of the Year of the Dragon. There are 3 primary gameplay elements: people tiles, action cards, and events. Each of the game's 12 rounds are split into 4 phases. Phase 1, at the start of each round, players select an action. Then, players each take a person tile and add that person to their village, augmenting the future actions that they might take. Phase 3, an event is resolved, and all players have to respond to that event. Then at the end of each round, there's a scoring phase. Each round, the game's 7 action cards are shuffled and randomly grouped based on the number of players in the game, and done so as evenly as possible. For example, in a 3-player game, these action cards are split into 3 groups, 2 groups of 2, and 1 group of 3 action cards. Then, in turn, based on a player's progress on the person track, governed by which tiles they've previously drafted and how many military actions they've taken, players select an action to carry out. These actions allow players to gain money, expand their palace, prepare for a fireworks show, score victory points, move up the person track based on their military prowess, or trade money for privilege, which will score them points at the end of every subsequent round. During the action selection round, players may select an action which was previously selected by another player, but only if they pay 3 money to the supply, a steep price. This not only applies to the specific actions taken by another player, but also all actions grouped together with that action, making you much more likely to select an action in a group not previously selected by another player. Each player begins the game with 11 person cards, 1 for each of the game's 9 types of people in the game, and 2 wilds. At setup, players choose 2 people tiles to add to their palace without spending a card. But during each round, during the person step, players in turn select one of the game's 9 person types, represented by the person tiles, to add to their palace, spending a matching card or one of their 2 wild cards to add that person to their palace, meaning you'll never be able to have more than 3 of the same type of person in your palace. People tiles augment the impact of actions players select in subsequent rounds, and also score 2 victory points at the end of each game, and might affect how certain events impact the play. Players are constantly striving to build up a robust population of people tiles in their palaces, because this gives you access to strong actions and mitigates the effect of negative events that might occur. At the start of each game, 10 event tiles of 5 types are shuffled and randomized behind 2 tiles that start each year in each play in the Year of the Dragon, representing peace. In that 3rd phase where events are resolved, the effects of each of these randomly assigned events are resolved. For example, a drought event might occur, which makes players have to pay rice equal to the number of palaces that they have. Or it might be a fireworks display that allows players to score points for the fireworks that they've put together. Or it might be an imperial tribute that forces players to pay 4 money to the supply, otherwise releasing people from their palace for every money that they can't pay. Typically, events either present scoring opportunities for players based on their progress towards certain goals or hurt players, forcing them to release people from their palaces if they can't meet the requirements of that event. Finally, at the end of each round, any passive scoring opportunities are tallied. After 12 rounds, players score a final time for people remaining in their palaces, monks in their palaces, based on the type of palaces that those monks are in, and any money they have remaining after trading in and selling back some goods. At which point, the player with the most points is crowned the victor.
Thank you, Brendan, for that rules overview. Hopefully that gives you some idea of what we'll be talking about in the rest of this episode, where we will characterize the decision space of this game. So, Brendan, what do you think we just start off with that?
Yeah, we have to start there. And I think that the most important thing to know about that when we discuss this game is that you get to see, it's a game based around these 12 rounds, right? And there are effects that get processed in every round that are really impactful. They affect the people that will maybe remain in your palace, or they affect scoring opportunities. And those are randomized. They're different every game outside of the first two, which are always peaceful, so nothing happens. You get a little bit of time to prepare. But then there's these dramatic random events that shape everything, but they're not random, because from the beginning of the game, you know every event that is going to occur and where in the game it's going to occur.
Yes.
Super interesting.
Really interesting. And, and it is kind of funny thematically to think about, like, what if you were like the ruler of a group of peoples or a castle, and you could just like foretell exactly the type of like crisis events that were coming to you.
Oh yeah, the Mongolian invasion is coming up this August. We've got to prepare.
On your Outlook calendar, you've got like, sure. Oh yeah, we do have that meeting with the Mongols. It's been sitting there.
Then there's
crap. I totally forgot to prepare for it.
The September drought, the October fireworks festival, and then But oddly enough, it kind of fits for me. Thematically, it sort of works, right? Like if you were trying to hold an empire together, I guess you're nobles. You're not actually an emperor. You're sort of nobles assisting the emperor in preparing for these events. You could kind of plan a year ahead, you know?
Yeah, sure. Some of them a little bit more so than others. Like, sure, firework festival, we could predict when that might be coming down the pike.
Maybe we don't know when there's going to be a tornado,
a plague,
or an earthquake. A little bit. That's why that's the super events expansion.
Yeah,
which we'll give our first impressions on later in the episode. But so Jake, I'm curious. So there's these two sort of randomizing elements in this game that kind of make up the motor of this game that creates the variability. There's the variable event tiles that come out that form the full Year of the Dragon. And then there's these random pairings of action selection cards that are grouped based on the number of players in the game. So if there's 3 players playing, these 8 or 9 action cards, depending on if you're playing with one of the expansions, will be grouped into 3 randomly selected groups, and then players select from those actions as part of each round of play. So those are really the two elements. One of them is completely known from the start of the game, and one of them is randomized, the actions, every single round. So you can plan, but you can't plan for what your opponents might do.
But it is randomized, but you always know what actions are going to be available, which is all of them. And the only impact of somebody else taking the action space you want or in the grouping is you have to pay 3 extra coins.
Which feels massive to me.
It feels, but if you have the coins, which you could easily get to a state in this game where like you kind of have an excess coins right towards the end. I don't know. I guess not easily, but it does feel like impactful. But not always tremendously. Like sometimes you can be like, I need to do this. And I have the money, so it doesn't matter what anyone's doing. I'm building more palace floors.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that one of the enticing things about this game is some games you're going to have a lot of money, because it's so much driven by you're augmenting your actions by selecting people. We'll get more into sort of how that works. And I talked about it some in the rules overview. But you have some wild cards. Everyone always has access to at least one of every person type available, but then you can push your sort of tableau in certain directions because you have 2 wilds. So maybe this game, I really invest in the money action up front, and then I have way more flexibility around what actions I'm selecting.
Or you invest in the people track, so you just always get to pick first for the rest of the game, which is pretty funny in a 2-player game, right? Like you could easily get so far out in front that your opponent's like, I'm not even going to interact with that anymore.
Right. And then if you do put yourself so far in front, maybe you've overinvested.
Yeah, right. You've given up other opportunities for sure.
So I definitely want to talk about that mechanism too. We got to put that on the list. But let's try to characterize our decision space here. I think that it has to be dynamic on some level because of the way that the actions come out. I think for me, just that pairing of these actions coming together randomly at the start of each round gives it a really dynamic feel because sort of your ability to do things, your agency is pushing in certain directions. I think you're going to make an argument that it's static. And there's an argument that it's static too. I don't think we've covered a lot of games on the show that feel like a mashup between a dynamic and a static game. And that sounds like a paradox or an oxymoron. But because you know all of the event tiles that are out, that feels sort of static. All the actions are always there. So that feels kind of static. But to me, the impact of the random pairings and whether you go first or not actually makes this game feel pretty dynamic. Because you can't just go in with a plan. You have to, 1, adapt to what your opponents are doing, but 2, adapt to the random pairings of these cards.
I think that aspect of the game is dynamic. For me, like the spirit of the game, like when I think of like the overall sense I get when I'm playing is actually waning.
Interesting,
like,
sure.
Like, and that has to do with the other aspect of the game, which is adding people to your palaces, which you start off with all the options of, but then that wanes down. And also, like, I find that right at the beginning of the game, you're going to have the opportunity to interact with all the events twice.
Yeah.
But then as that wanes down, there are like actions that you're just not interested in taking anymore, right? Like after the famines have both passed, like I'm eliminating the rice tile from my options and action. Like that would do me no good.
Yep. No, totally. And I think I'm really glad you said that, Jake, because that really does capture the essence of this game. Because so many of the events, some of the events are scoring opportunities. Some of them are scoring opportunities that just hurt you. If you're behind, if you haven't pursued enough, you're going to have to lose a person from your palaces. You're going to lose a part of your tableau that affects your agency in the game. And then some of them are just straight up, you better have prepared for this because if you don't have the ability to fight disease, well, a contagion event is happening and everyone has to release 3 people. So this game, the soul of it is the game is waning and you're trying to fight back as hard as you can and fight that waning wave and make your palace and your tableau as large as possible as the whole game and all your opponents just push on you to try to tear you down and kill your people and tear your palaces away.
The other really important element to think about this decision space and where it feels distinct from a lot of other games we've covered and a lot of Feld's other offering is that it feels so much more clear. Like I think the clarity the decision space affords you and especially from like when you think of like long-term strategy is, you know, it's almost like a game of Castles of Burgundy if like you knew ahead of you rolled all your dice and you're like, okay, these are the 25 different dice pairings that you'll use in order and like how that would change the game. That's how I feel about the fact that you get to see all the events in order here. And that can be fun to navigate, but it can also like that's when I say like this game makes me feel dumb because it's like I feel like all the information is there in front of me and it's just like up to me to like it puts more onus on the player to like be smart. And whereas like in like Castle of Burgundy where you can just like roll bad, it's like, well, I rolled bad, you know, so that's why I'm like not doing good this game, which feels nice as a player.
Yeah.
Where this has that sort of like brutal sense of like, no, you're doing bad because you're dumb. There are ways in which it pushes back against that a little bit, but I think you have to be like, it's not even super clear until you've played it a few times, like where those elements are. And I think they are coming from the randomness of the flop of actions to some greater or lesser extent. And I guess they're also coming from the fact that you can't pick the exact same two palace people to start with as anyone else in the game.
Sure.
So that forces you to be on like a different path. But without that, basically like there would be a single optimal path that everyone would try to follow that you could math out. And that is just something to be aware of. I think that's something that really defines this decision space.
Yeah, that's very interesting. There's also a little bit, I guess, in terms of, like you said, so you start at a different, and then where you put your people in your palaces, because that can affect when you're releasing people. But like you said, there probably is, at the start of this game, there's an optimal path, and it's about trying to stick as much to that as possible. That's a really fascinating way to take it. I want to respond to your other point really quickly, Jake. How the openness of the information about the events can make players feel dumb. I don't know if you've ever heard this anecdote, but back when Magic the Gathering was really new and they knew they wanted to create a pro tour, and they knew that they didn't just want the only format to be bring your own deck of your own cards, they wanted to have some sort of limited environment, right? So you open packs and you make a deck with what you have. They thought that what this drafting environment would be you'd open the pack, everyone at the table would see all the cards in the pack, and you would all pick from that face-up display. But because the information of opening that pack was completely open, it was very paralyzing to people, and it created this environment where people really drafted slowly. They felt bad if they made the wrong decision because everyone saw they got to make the wrong decision. So they just moved the packs to the players' hands because the information is then more personal. So it's this interesting mirroring of sort of a way different game, but the same consequences. I
don't feel like AP is really an issue many people would have with this game.
I don't think reason. AP is
I don't know
either.
why, but because I do think it's similar in that way. But maybe it's just because of the fact that like all the actions are the same, and like once you're in the middle of the game, it's so clear like what's going to be like more profitable to you.
Yep.
I guess that's another way that this feels clear, because you get to a point of, why do I never remember this word? I'm blaming the cool again. Not async, but
asymmetric?
Yeah, you quickly come to like very asymmetric positions where like I have a rice gardener guy in my palace, so that action is twice as valuable to me as to you, and so on and so forth. Not to mention like I don't have any rice and that event's coming up in 1 or 2 turns. So like, I really need to take this. Like all those things make it so that I've found that it's really easy to quickly eliminate like half or more of your options based on that. And based on where other players have gone, right? You can kind of really quickly narrow in to one of like, it's 8, right?
8 actions? Yeah, 8 actions.
Yeah. No, is there 8?
7.
Yeah, I thought it was like there must be an odd number.
It's 8 if you add the wall.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can an 8 and 7, but yeah, like that also, I think if the game is like both like super hard from like it's challenging and punishing from like a long-term strategic overview, but on your turn it's pretty easy once you've like really gained mastery of the different systems in play, which I also had a lot of trouble with. Like which maybe we could talk about in a second. Like there's just a lot of different stuff that works differently. But assuming like you really understand everything well, I think getting to like an optimal point, an optimal decision based on all the mistakes you've made previously is like not too difficult.
Yeah, some of that too. I think that the face up, you hinted at this, but I want to emphasize this point because it's one of my favorite parts about the decision space of this game is this game is about maximizing your ability to deal with bad things happening to you, right? So you will always have to release people in this game from your palaces. It will inevitably happen to you. So what does that mean this game is about? This game is about releasing people at the most opportune times. So like you said, there's these 2 points in the game where people are going to have to pay rice based on the number of palaces that they have full of people. Palaces are good. You score a point at the end of each round for every palace you have. So you want to build lots of palaces, but it means that you need more rice when these events come up. Because they're randomized, one game, you might have an event where the 2 rice events are all the way at the end, where you only need to feed your people towards the end of the year because that's when the droughts are going to happen. Another game, they might come and both be in the first few events. And then in a third and different game, right, you might have one early on and one towards the end. And all those scenarios feel really differently from a planning perspective, because once those events are gone, like Jake said, you never have to worry about feeding your people with having rice around again. You can let your rice farmers go. If there's a contagion event, they get to the top of the list. And I think figuring out how to optimally release people is this really fun puzzle of sort of, what do I still need in terms of just meeting the conditions of the events that are coming. And events kind of fall into these different tiers of like, I have to be ready for this. I might want to do this. It depends on what other people do. Are other people going to commit to the fireworks display? Do I have a large chance of being the best scorer in that event? Great, I want to commit to it. If not, I'll just put my toe in a little bit. The Mongol invasion, which is a sort of military event, is kind of similar to that. So there's these sort of different realms of trying to guess if you should push and really specialize, or maybe pull back and look for points elsewhere. So those are some of my favorite decisions in the game.
My favorite decisions, I think, it actually spans both the action selection and the people selection or whatever, which is that like this game it reminds me of like, I think I meant to look this up beforehand, but when did Dominion come out?
I think 2011.
Okay, so a little while after this, but I think like this game has such a clear trade-off between like progressing your game state and scoring points.
2008. I got to correct it.
So 2008, right in the same
right
time.
at the same
and
time.
It feels like it's very like similar design ethos going around, because right, Dominion, that's the whole thing, right? You build up an engine, and then to actually win, you have to like start adding victory points into it, into your deck, which then makes your engine worse. And here, you know, anytime you take an action that is going to score you points or put a person in your palace for the purpose of scoring points, it like directly, you know, that's, you're giving them an opportunity to like deal with the event.
Yep.
Like you're making your actual like position like and the stability of your palace worse.
I love that comparison, Jake, because also Dominion starts and you have a completely known information on the board of all the tables you might ever buy. It's kind of like the strategic planning in Dominion of what path am I going to go down feels pretty similar to In the Year of the Dragon, but the interactivity of the action selection, I think, pushes maybe players in a little bit different directions here. Dominion, you might miss a beat and end up buying a different card because you get forced into a cheaper card than your opponent does or something. So there's a little bit of that. But I think that that's a really interesting comparison.
This might be one of those like twin decision spaces that you wouldn't expect.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe that's not true because obviously like the mechanics are so different, but I think they do share some pretty important similarities when you're kind of like thinking about the decision space in more abstract terms.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, Jake. So let's pivot the conversation a little bit to this question, because for people who talk about this game, it's always discussed as being a really brutal game. I think a huge part of that is the built-in need to hit certain beats. When the contagion event comes up, everyone at the table has to release 3 people unless they've brought healers into their palaces who have these little mortar and pestle symbols on them. And if you can ignore it, if you have, for every mortar and pestle you have, you ignore the need to release 1 person. So if you have 3 mortar and pestles, you get to ignore all 3, the need to release 3 people. Usually, though, that's not going to be the case, but that mechanism feels pretty brutal. If you have a palace that doesn't have people in it, sort of deteriorates because no one's living in that palace. So even if you've built up, the game is pulling you back over time. There's this decay that happens through that. What do you think, Jake? Do you think that that's an earned reputation, or is it just because so many? If more games had this sense of fighting against the waning spirit of the game and the decay forced by the game, do you think we would feel that this game itself was especially brutal, or is it just the juxtaposition of so many games that people play? And that are popular right now are about these dopamine hits of building up and getting more, not trying to fight against losing.
Where I'm at now with the game after playing it like a dozen times or whatever, it doesn't feel that brutal. Like it feels like I know what to expect. It feels pretty manageable to like hit the important points. Sometimes, I mean, I don't think like in any of my last like 5 or 6 games, I've really like had a huge disaster where I'm like, was unable to prepare for something at all that just like totally wiped me out. But when I was learning the game, which I hinted to in my overview, I definitely found this to be incredibly brutal. But I think that speaks more to the open information, right? And like the
Yeah.
clarity the game offers you. Because it really, I think, the first time you play it, you might not do that well just because like you don't know those beats as
Hmm.
much and when it's important to do stuff. And also you might just not have like internalized what is frankly like a game that's just like full of edge case rules. Maybe not edge case rules, but it's just like a lot of different stuff. Like all the events work differently, all the people work differently, right? You mentioned like the healer has like you don't have to activate them; they just like help you out. Whereas like the rice person, like that increases your rice collection, like when you take that action. Like everything works differently, so it's like totally understandable how in the first time or two playing this, you're gonna end up with like a low score and a more in the 20s or something, and a more experienced person is gonna score somewhere near 100 potentially or more, and that can feel brutal, right? If you're scoring 20 and like have no palace at the end, like a few people and your opponent's got like a big palace thing and they score it. And I think that's heightened by the fact that the decision space is so clear, and it makes, fairly or not, it makes you think like, wow, I'm pretty dumb because like I saw all this coming and I could do nothing to stop it when
Yeah.
clearly there was a way through to avoid these disasters.
I definitely think a part of the brutality too. It's probably a fair reputation, even if there are more games that had this sort of feel. I think there's a few little things that sort of contribute. But like you said, the more I play, the more I enjoy that, because when you get better at the game, you really feel a sense of mastery for being able to fill up a palace. I will say at this point, I feel like you're a little bit better at this game than me, Jake, and you experience palace envy in this game some, where you look over and you're like, how do you have all those people? How are your palaces so big? My palaces are just decimated by.
I feel like I beat you like one time.
Yeah, but you're going to beat me in the two other games that we have going right now. But I will say another piece of, I think, why you felt there was so much is, at its core, this is a point salad game. You're going to score from all these different events potentially, and then there's also extra little rules, right? Like you're going to score for each palace you have at the end of every round. You're going to score for any court ladies you have at the end of every round. And then you score your privilege tokens, which are this other thing to wrap your head around, where you can basically, the earlier you buy these tokens, the more victory points they're worth. But you have to wrap your head around that because you score them at the end of every round. So it's sort of, I think that there's some mental load to that. And then at the end of the game, you score every person you have, not your palaces. You score each of your monks based on how many floors in each palace there are. So that's a little thing to prepare for. And then you also score your money. So there's just lots of things to think about in terms of incentives.
I think it's really hard to like, at least for me, to like understand and like visualize where points are coming from, especially in like early plays. And you also don't realize like how bad things are gonna get or not, right? Where like I think that's like the most I've found improvement in this game is like understanding like when you can take an offbeat to buy a privilege or put a court lady into your palace.
Yep.
And you don't need to be preparing for the next bad event that's coming down the pike, because you definitely don't always need to be doing that in this game. But how could you know that the first time you're playing this game?
One of the cool things that's very tough to evaluate sometimes too can be early on, right? Those privilege tokens that score at the end of every round can be very powerful, because if you buy them in maybe round one, that's 12 points. Oh, I just pushed a button and I got 12 points. But this whole game, right, is about trying to stay in a positive feedback loop and avoid getting stuck in a negative feedback loop. And when it feels brutal is because if something goes wrong, the chances of more things going wrong just explodes. If you lose your ability to have the rice action be powerful for you because you lose your little rice farmer who has two rice symbols, so your action, instead of making 3 rice, goes to just making 1 or whatever it is, that's terrible for you. So, and if that happens before you ever get the chance to use them, you're going to spiral and you're not going to catch up. Events that could have been positive are going to be negative. But the flip side is if you just barely stay on the wave and you know, the first few bumps, you just make it over them, then you can turn that into the positive feedback loop where you have more time because you're taking stronger actions that let you take stronger actions in the future and score more points. So I think that the brutality comes from the fact that if you make a little mistake, it can end up feeling like a massive mistake.
Yeah, that's really insightful. And I just, while we're on the topic of like how much different stuff there is in this game, I think that's another way that it doesn't feel like a Feld game to me.
Mm.
And at least when I think of like the more modern Feld offering, where I feel like the game is like distilled down to like Castle Burgundy. It's like 4 actions, and they're all really easy to understand. And the same with like Bonfire. Like, yeah, it's like a complex game, but like understanding like the core of it is pretty simple. It's like I can understand how each of these like 6 actions work or whatever it is in that game. Whereas here, there's just more actions. There's 7, and then there's also like the whatever dozen different type of people. Maybe not a dozen. How many people are there in this game?
Ooh, that's a good question.
But it's a lot, and you have to know like all of them at the very beginning, and like understand how they like interact with the game system over the course of the game. So I think that's just a different thing. I think the mental overload, or not overload, but the mental load there is pretty high compared to some of the other Feld games, or even like Notre Dame is another one that's like feels like a much more simple core.
Yep.
Even if like the actions you're doing is like I just pick one and I put a verse in, like that's easy to understand. But I just feel like it requires more like capacity to like know how everything works together than in some of those other games.
Yeah, there's 9.
Okay.
9 people. I think that this game has the classic Feld sort of enigma where it can feel like a lot to learn up front. And then once you've learned it, sort of like, oh, this is a pretty simple game. It's pretty straightforward once you've internalized the rules.
I still find myself playing on like Board Game Arena, like clicking on like the events and just like
to see what it does.
How exactly does this work again?
Sure.
And the same with some of the people. Maybe not so much now, but until like very recently, I'd be doing that on almost every turn. I'm like log back in. It's like, okay, wait, this is the famine works this way. And that's different from the plague, which does this other thing.
I think that's really fair. I've definitely had to recheck how the tax action works of how much money am I going to get exactly based on the number of tokens that I have and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and you get the full, and it costs 4. Like how much? I was confused in one of the games. Like, wait, I had the 3 money I needed to pay the guy. It's like, oh, he takes 4 money. It's like,
because anyone can always take. That's another quirk that kind of trips you up. There's another secret action in this game, which is that you can always take up to 3 money. So if you have 2 money, you can take 1 money. If you have 1 money, you can take 2. If you have 0, you can take 3. But if you have 3 money, that action does nothing. You have to use the actual action that gains you money. So there's some little interesting edges like you were talking about here. But the other thing that I feel like is punishing about this game is that the card system, which is that there's 9 types of people in the game, and you start the game with 1 of each of those cards. So and then you also start with 2 wilds. So you can only ever recruit each type of person 1 time, plus you have 2 that you can recruit randomly, and then you have your 2 starting people. So you base your strategy around what are my starting people, what are the events that are out, and what do I want to use my 2 wilds on? So if something goes wrong, part of the negative feedback loop and why you can't recover is if you've invested in sort of getting someone who generates rice and then you feel you have to release that person, you lose them. You might not even have the ability, if you use your 2 wilds already, to go get another person to replace it. Just in this game, you have no agency to go and prove that action anymore. And that's an adjustment. But the hand management puzzle of that, so fun. I love strategically planning my palaces based on the board.
How differently do you think the game would play out if that was eliminated and you could just always take whatever?
I think the problem is it would create edge cases where
you just like, I just take all the whatever.
I'm just investing in the research guy, and every round I'm going for research, and then I'm picking the books and I'm scoring 20 points. I think it's there to sort of prevent that sort of edge case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is like a weird system. Like I think that feels very different than something you would see today. And I would almost say like inelegant. There's like a whole discussion on our Discord and our pre-planner channel, which if you want to help us prepare for these episodes and play along with us, come join the conversation there. Link in the description of this podcast. But a lot of people are saying this is like a very elegant game. And I feel like it's a very inelegant game because of all those, like all the rules, everything working a little bit differently and being like having a difficult core loop to internalize because of just how much different subsystems are interacting.
Yeah, that's
maybe
interesting.
Not subsystems, but just like action choices. There are a lot of subsystems. Like you could have a palace that's only this big, and like the card thing works differently. And if your palace is empty, it's gone. And the way the income thing works is like it's just like more. I think a lot of those things today, if this game was pitched, like a developer might be like,
How can we smooth
how
out
can we
these
like
edges?
smooth out some of these rules?
I think too, for me, part of the elegance in a game comes from something where all the numbers just kind of line up perfectly and you don't have to always reference the rules to know what's going to happen. So I think that's where I see your sort of counter argument of this being an elegant game is sort of things like, oh no, I actually do have to check what the fireworks event says and how
Right.
many victory points will I score. And
you lose half rounded which way?
exactly, that sort of stuff. But I will say the overall structure, once you've internalized everything, it does feel like a pretty straightforward game. And it's sort of amazing how well the pieces fit together once you get it. It's about getting it, though.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, what is elegant? We don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Maybe we'll do a whole episode on that in the future at some point.
Probably should. But
yeah. Okay, Jake, what do you think I want to talk about this question of like what makes a Feld a Feld, or at least what's a mechanic in this game that feels very Feldian? So do you have something that comes to mind? I'm curious if it'll be the same thing.
Well, to me, this feels like probably the least Feldian. I have played. It's weird because I think like some of his more modern games feel like closer bunched together.
Yeah.
In some ways, like Carpe Diem, Castles of Burgundy, Bruges, which is, I mean, it's not that modern, but like Castles of Tuscany, like I think those share more similar design ethos than this, or like Aquasphere, or there's like he has like a auction game called like the Sprick. I'm not even gonna try like the Spickled Stalt or something. Okay, I tried. Dang it! I said I wasn't gonna do that, but I don't know. Like I don't know that it feels like particularly like of Feld's canon, because to me it is a point salad, but it like pushes back against that a lot. Like I feel like when I think of point salad, I think of like everything you do is going to be like helping you in some way. And while that's like sort of true here, like it just feels so much more like trading off the points gathering from like the things that are helping you like maintain your game state and improve your game state.
Yeah. I think maybe I framed the question too large and I've betrayed our ability to answer it because it's too hard without doing a full study of Feld. I think you're right. For me, this does feel like that classic Feld problem of here's a lot of different ways to score points. Find the best way in this specific play to score the most points. And what's best in this game might not be best in a different game. And that's part of the interesting depth of Feld games is that every play of a game feels like a different puzzle. But for me, the thing that shines through the most of like, oh yes, this game was designed by Stefan Feld is the player-driven turn order around taking actions. So there's this trade-off between I can invest my energy, my potential output in this game, my agency, into going first, or I can invest my energy and my agency into doing more, but I'll go second. So in this game, that takes the form of on every tile. This is one of the confusing systems.
This is another interesting, like confusing subsystem. I do really love this aspect of the game.
Yeah. So most tile types in the game have two different versions of a tile. There's going to be stronger effects that will have multiple symbols. So for example, there's a rice farmer that has 2 rice bags. So when you take the rice action, you get 2 additional bags of rice, which is great. That's really powerful. But it only gives you 1 on the this like priority track in the game. Or there's a weaker rice farmer that only has a 1 bag on it, but it has a 4. So when you take that, you move up this initiative track essentially, and whoever's further along that initiative track always goes first. And then you take actions in that initiative order. And I think for me, that's one of the things that feels very Feldy about this, of that trade-off between it's so difficult to sort of say, how can I parse what the value of going first is in every turn going forwards? And am I really doing that because Jake could take back the ability to go first, even if I get ahead? And that's a really fun, impossible puzzle sort of at the core of this game.
I think that is some of the most fun decision making too, because even if you're not just like picking between the same action, you're also like might be considering like, okay, I'd really want to like improve my palace as like an action, and then there's like another action that's like building out your palace is one of the actions, and then there's another action that that would help me, but it's like not as essential. But even taking like the base form of it, is going to give me more people track points than this other one.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, how do you like weigh that? And that's really fun.
And then there's the sort of instances where I sort of maybe I see that, Jake, you're in a situation, I've already invested in a lot of rice, so I don't need rice. So I'm probably not going to take the rice action. You don't have any. I'm choosing between, because the actions randomly get paired together, I can choose between doing this action now that's in this group that you wouldn't be interested in, or I could just take the action that's paired with the rice action to sort of put an even bigger tax on you. So it's this light bit of interactivity where if it was a toss up, maybe I actually take the action that's paired with the rice, so that if you want to do that, you have to pay. And I think that that's kind of fun too. And it makes me look over and see what you're doing.
Definitely. Another game that becomes more heads up the more you play it.
Yeah.
And that's something that, is a lot more fun, but I think it takes some doing to get to that state.
Yep.
Right? You're so like worried about getting devastated by all the events in that first play. Like you can hardly be thinking about your opponent's palaces and everything. But definitely that's what the game becomes all about.
Yep.
Which is cool.
It's cool too how the more you play, the more you can appreciate when someone does something that's sort of like, wow, you are confident right now. So if someone opens with one of their 2 starting people as a court lady, who provides you no benefit except for the fact that at the end of every round you score 1 additional point, sort of like, oh, you feel very prepared. You think that based on these events, you're going to have lots of time to get ready to deal with some of the downsides. So you're like calling your shot from the start of the game.
I did that recently, I think, but it was less because of that and more because I was like the 4th person to go in a 4-person game. And like, I really wanted like, the builder or like whatever it was, like maybe the Mongol events are coming up early. So, but like everybody had like taken that and something else. So it's like, if I wanted, I had to go all the way down to like my 4th top pick or something.
Yeah. That's totally true. I actually love that it forces you into different pairs. I think that's a really important design decision that makes this game as interesting as it is.
Just to our point about how the game improves with time and more plays, that might be showing its age a bit too, right? Where it's more important to smooth out the rough edges so that first play is intuitive and fun in 2022 than it is in 2007, right?
Definitely. Yeah.
Where publishers could be more and designers could be more confident that their games are going to get played 10 times.
Yeah, definitely. I think really quickly, I know that Jake, you and I have only delved into the expansions a little bit, but this game was republished 10 years after it first came out. And in that publication, they re-released some expansions that came out only previously in this thing called the Aaliyah Treasure Chest in 2009. I think that that's true. So this was like the first large wide release of these 2 expansions. And I would love to talk about them and get your impressions, our first impressions, because I've only played a couple games with each, and I think you have as well.
Yeah.
But they might inform the sort of decisions overall. So I'm curious what you think of them. Here, I'll explain them for the listeners. The 2 expansions, one's sort of like a full expansion and one's kind of a mini expansion. So the full expansion is the Great Wall. So this is cool. It adds a new action that just gets shuffled in and split in the same way. And the action is a build a wall action. And then you can build a segment of the wall. Everyone starts with these wall tiles that have certain effects on them that are all different. One might give you 3 gold. One might give you can build a segment of your palace if you take the build a wall action and you spend that wall section tile that you have that builds a section of the palace, or maybe it gets you a firework or a bag of rice, just these little nice effects. So it's sort of a flexible action that's always good for you and always different. But it's tied to the Mongol invasion event, because as you build these out, basically if players haven't built the wall up to the point that the Mongol invasion occurs every round, the player who has contributed to the wall the least gets hit and they lose some people. And otherwise, if you have built it up to that point, players score points equal to the investment that they've made into the wall. So if I've built 3 of the sections, I would score 3 victory points for doing that. What do you think of this expansion, Jake?
I really like this expansion. I think it does sort of smooth out some of those rough edges. What I really like about it is when you get to take that action, you get one of like 6 different options of what to do. And I feel like that is a way that the design is the only way really that the design is like charitable to players where it's
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, you may have like missed a step here, but you could just like take this action and like you could have a firework, or you could have a couple of coins as whatever you need.
Yep.
And it feels good just to like, it feels rewarding to take the action. It feels good to get those things. And I do think it probably overall improves the player experience just a bit, like very little downside in terms of rules overhead. It's pretty intuitive and easy to get up and running. So I like it,
Yeah, I really like this expansion. I think that in some ways it's almost a modernizing expansion in that it
Yeah.
adds that little bit of flexibility. But I think it's really fun getting to plan around these sort of effects. And sometimes based on how the actions come out, maybe I was planning to take the rice action, but the opportunity might present itself. I have the wall tile that just gives me a bag of rice. Maybe I'll do that instead and see if I can kind of get in. So it gives you more nuanced decisions, I think is what I'm saying. It's kind of we always talk about those examples where it's a decision, it's a mechanism in the game that increases your agency.
Yeah.
Usually it's a token that you can spend to break a rule. Here, you're kind of spending these tiles to a little bit break a rule, but you're just getting a partial little effect, but to
this feels like the most Feldian aspect of the whole game, probably because it was designed
later
around, closer in proximity to his more popular designs.
Totally. It doesn't surprise me either that we both love it, because to a starving man, like any meal tastes delicious, So when
you're like, one firework,
yeah,
bless the Lord,
thank goodness, yeah. And then the other expansion is this. It's called Mega Events. This is a mini expansion. It's basically in round 7, you add this added mega event that could happen that really dramatically has the potential to shape how the game plays out. So I'm going to read some of them. For example, at the end of round 7, it's the Lantern Festival, and players score people in their palaces. You just score 2 victory points. Great. That one's just one of the nice ones. I want to start with one of the nice ones.
You get 2 per person.
2 per person, just like at the end of the game.
Okay.
Yeah. Then there's ones like the Tornado, which is each player at the end of round 7 has to discard 2 of their person cards remaining in their hand. And then what that means is that the players only have 1 card each for months 8, 9, and 10, 11, and 12. No, sorry, for 8 and 9. And then for months 10, 11, and 12, you just don't recruit people, because there was a tornado that damaged the civilization so much. So it just completely reshapes how brutal the back end is.
Yeah, I actually haven't completed any games because I'm like playing async with some of these now.
Sure.
But my initial impression is that I don't really care for this. Yeah. I think it just like adds that like more of that mental tax of like forward planning that this game already, as we've discussed, is incredibly taxing about.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, if you're like, oh, I wish this game had like more clarity in what was going to happen so that I could like use my massive brain to like even more outthink my opponents, then sure.
I could see liking this expansion if I'd played 50 games of In the Year of the Dragon and I wanted something to mix it up. I could see liking some of these and really not liking others. There's one, Jake, called Assassination Attempt that just says at the end of round 7, all players must discard all their privilege tiles. That's not interesting, really. It just means that
so privilege, you just probably don't buy one.
Yeah, privilege just isn't good this game, is what that really says. So that to me weakens the decisions that you get to make. It doesn't give this game particularly a more interesting shape.
But it is, I guess, an attempt to like add more variety to this game, which Definitely. I think a lot of people would enjoy. That this game does not feel very variable from game to game. And I think I'm one of those people. Just like it feels like there's some actions that are just like better early on in general, like, or some people rather that like you kind of like to be starting with. And I don't know if it's like more just like how I'm approaching the game, but I feel like the more I play, like I'm sort of settling into patterns of play that work. And that's making my games play more stagnant. Maybe I should be trying to like branch out and do more like crazy privilege, like court lady strategy, and like see, I was really surprised to learn that the game also was edited in the newer edition so that the price of the large privilege that gives you 2 points a turn went from 6 to 7 because that was like perceived as an overpowered opening to just start your first turn by paying 6 for the 2 privilege that gives you 20 points in the course of the game. I would have never considered doing that, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't think I would have like figured that out on my own if like I hadn't seen somebody do it first. Just because like the way I'm approaching this game is like, okay, what's the next event? Like I want to be like prepared for it a lot more. So maybe that's partially on me to like find more innovative and explore the play space more. But I don't know how much like I want to do that.
Sure. I've had a lot of fun trying to mess with that. I really like this privilege mechanism of you sort of invest in these tiles early on. You give up potentially some ability to build an engine, honestly, right? But what you get for it in return is a bunch of points over the course of the game. I think that's really interesting, and sort of seeing how far I can push that is a fun way to sort of up the ante and add some tension early on in the game of like, can I make this decision? I also really like the research strategy where there's these one person type where it's a scholar and there's a certain number of books, and then there's a research action which just says you gain 1 victory point plus 1 for each book icon on your scholars. Scholars have 3 or 2. So I've had a couple games where against Jake I've gone all in on scholars. I was able to grab the tile with 3 books and then a couple 2 books, and every time I took the research action I was scoring 6 points. And then just trying to see if I could push on that pedal hard enough that I got over the finish line.
I think you're more of like an explorer.
Yeah, like a Johnny.
Yeah. You're like gonna like push up against the edges of game system, where I'm like more of like an optimizer. Like find something that works and tweak it. I'm curious, when you go to like a favorite restaurant, do you order something different or get the same meal? Because I'm definitely like I know what I like and I get that.
I can go both ways. I have my favorites that I like, but I'm never, if we go to a restaurant 6 times a year, at least 3 of those times I'm going to try to dip into something new. Yeah. For sure. That's funny. I'm glad that through gameplay you saw that. I guess in closing thoughts, Jake, like what do you like most, or like what will stick with you from this game, or will anything stick with you? Or is this just like... Yeah.
I think what sticks with me the most is that it feels like a very unique and fun Feld game. Feld is a lot of his games I really love. I think, overall probably my favorite designer just in terms of overall output. So like the collector in me is like, I should probably like get this and just like add it to the collection. But I still, so now that I've like played it this much, I like it. I would keep playing it. Like if we did like a decision space tournament or something, I would participate. I think that would be a fun one. But I don't know that it has the potential to rise up into my favorites. And I think maybe that's just because of personal preference of like liking more of that cloudy decision space that's less known turn to turn than this one offers.
Yeah. I think for me, I really like tableau builders. We haven't covered a ton of games that sort of feel that way on the show, and this definitely has that feel. So it works for me on that level. But I think for me, what will stick most is one, the sort of how ripe of a system it is to sort of fight against this waning force, not because of how brutal it feels at the start, but because of how good it feels when you master it. Like you really feel like you accomplish something in this game when you play the game well, which I don't think I can always say for all the games we cover on the show. And then the other thing that will stick with me is just how cool the system is of laying out all those events at the beginning, and the motif of it being a year across these sort of 12, the 2-piece and the 10 randomized tiles. I think it's cute, but it's also a really rich way to add variability to the game without too much randomness. So I thought that was a novel system that I'm surprised more games don't have. Some games have seeding the board or whatever, but this feels a little different to me in some way. Yeah. So I'd love to see that in more games.
Is it your favorite Feld game?
It's a good question. It's tough. I really like the Castles of Burgundy. I've come around on Carpe Diem. I liked Bonfire the more I played it. I think right now it's definitely in contention for my favorite Feld game. I think I absolutely like this more than Carpe Diem. I do like it more than Bonfire. So it really comes down to, do I like it more than Castles of Burgundy? I haven't played Castles of Burgundy on the table in a couple years, so I would like to be able to do that. I think for me, Castles of Burgundy just plays better on the table than it does digitally. I like it digitally, but it's fun on the table. Yeah, I like playing with the tiles. So if I did that, there's a chance I would end up liking this more. But it's a contender. And I think I have fun with this game, but I also just really, from an intellectual perspective, think it's awesome. It's just like a really cool case study. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our episode. As always, we just want to thank you all so much for listening. We want to make another appeal for reviews. We'd love to read out some more reviews on the show, and that would really help us to grow. But just being here and listening this long means a ton.
And we're going to get Jake a doctor tile, a healer right away, so he can heal up. As a reminder, we're taking a break next week, so don't know that there won't be a Decision Space episode that appears in your feed. Just go check out the backlog. There's like 100 episodes. So many games to explore.
Not quite. There are 99.
There are 99. Yes. That's the last time we could say that. But I guess happy end of the year to all of you. And we'll be really excited to be back the week after that with more episodes talking about future Decision Space.
Yeah. And we should, as always, thank Hembry for our intro and outro song, Reach Out. Bye.
Bye.